The new ACT English section has 50 questions and you have 35 minutes to complete the section. And remember, for every single section of the ACT, it's extremely important that you answer all of the questions and that you have plenty of time to really answer the final few questions, not just guess on them. So, how do you make a strategy that will allow you to answer all the questions on the English section on time? And how do you prepare to get a high score? Step 1 is to read the passage and answer the questions as you come to them. It's important that you read the entire passage, even if there aren't any questions in the sentence that you're reading, because context is key to the ACT English section. So, if you're taking notes, write step 1. Read the passage and answer the questions as you come across them. And here's why. Context is key to the ACT English section. There are two types of questions on the ACT English section: grammar questions and reading comprehension questions. That's right, there are reading comprehension questions on the ACT English section. And the context you have from reading the entire passage will really help you answer these questions correctly. Now, we're going to do an example of a reading comprehension question in just a second, but first, it's time to learn step 2. Step 2 is to know when you're answering a grammar question and when you're answering a reading comprehension question. And this is actually super easy because all the grammar questions will ask you which answer choice is grammatically acceptable. And the reading comprehension questions, well, they do not ask you which answer is grammatically acceptable. And here's why knowing whether you're answering a grammar question or a reading comprehension question is so important. If you're answering a grammar question, there are very strict grammar rules that might even have to be learned in school that you must follow in order to answer the question correctly. The good news is, if you know the grammar rules, you will get these questions correct. And you can practice all these grammar rules in the Learn section of the study guide. But the reading comprehension questions ask you some kind of weird questions with rules that you definitely did not learn in school. And these are rules that are specific to the ACT, and they're things you need to learn by watching the rest of this video if you want to do well on the ACT English section. So it's almost time to do some practice reading comprehension questions, but first, if you're taking notes, write this down. Step 2, know whether you're answering a grammar question or a reading comprehension question. Grammar questions simply ask which option is grammatically acceptable. All the other questions are reading comprehension questions. Now, let's practice reading the entire passage and answering the questions as we come to them, and take some notes on reading comprehension questions as we go. Are you ready? Let's jump in.
Hey, what's up, guys? It's Michael. I'm a tutor at Classic Test Prep, and today we're going to take a look at some ACT English questions, paying special attention to those reading comprehension questions we've been talking about. But we're going to start with step 1, which is to read the entire passage. So even though there aren't any questions associated with these first few sentences, we're going to be reading the entire passage anyway. During the early 20th century, many goods cost a few pennies or less. Candy lovers could buy a gumball or Tootsie Roll for a penny. Moviegoers could watch a reel of a Charlie Chaplin film for a penny or two. Today, though, with the cumulative effects of inflation, the penny has almost zero purchasing power. Think about it. When's the last time you bought something for a penny? Although many of us harbor fond memories of collecting pennies in a piggy bank, it's time to do the practical thing: retire the US penny. Okay, so the first thing we notice is that the question here is a reading comprehension question because there's nothing asking us whether this question is grammatically acceptable or not. So this is going to be a reading comprehension question, and this is a special type of reading comprehension question because the answer choices start with yes and no. And so we're going to pay attention to that. And the first thing that we want to do is read the second half of the answer choices after we read the question. The writer is considering revising the underlined portion to the following: still gather pennies in change trays. Given that the information is accurate, should the writer make this revision? So it's asking us if we want to change the sentence to, although many of us still gather pennies in change trays, it's time to do the practical thing: retire the penny. And the question is, should we make that change or not? Now, this is a little bit confusing because you might not immediately know whether the answer to this question is yes or no, and that's okay. You're not supposed to. It's actually really easy to get these questions correct if we just pay attention to all of the information that follows yes and no. So for answer choice F, because the revision more clearly suggests that pennies in bulk still have at least some value. Well, that's just wrong. The second half, the explanation for why this answer would be yes, doesn't make any sense. So the answer cannot be F. G, because the revision more clearly suggests that nostalgia is unrelated to the purchasing power of the penny. This answer choice is wrong because the sentence isn't really about the purchasing power of the penny. The sentence is about retiring the penny. So that answer choice is wrong. Answer choice H says no, because the original more clearly suggests that nostalgia may be hindering the retirement of the penny. Now, this is going to be the correct answer. And it's really important to note that the second half of this statement is just true, right? Because the original more clearly suggests that nostalgia may be hindering the retirement of the penny. And that's true. That's what the sentence says. And then answer choice J is also wrong. No, because the original more clearly suggests that pennies would have little to no sentimental value if they were retired. That is false. This is talking about some sort of sentimental value. So the answer to 16 is H. Now, one thing to note, whenever you see numbers or letters in brackets, you really want to pay attention to that because a question like number 17 is coming up. So that means that we're going to be asked where to place something or which order we should put sentences in. Producing and distributing pennies isn't cheap. And in that year alone, the mint made nearly 6.5 billion pennies, costing the US over $170 million. This automatically doesn't make sense because I don't know what year I'm talking about when sentence 2 comes up, so I know that I'm going to be switching around these sentences. Sentence 3, in 2022, the US Mint spent 2.72 cents to put each penny into circulation. Question 17, which sequence of sentences presents the writer's argument most logically? Well, A, no change is wrong, right? Because we just read it and it made no sense. B, sentence 1 first, sentence 3 second, and sentence 2 third. Let's read that. Producing and distributing pennies isn't cheap. In 2022, the US Mint spent 2.72 cents to put each penny into circulation. And sentence 2, and in that year alone, the Mint made nearly 6.5 billion pennies, costing the US over $170 million. Answer choice B is definitely the correct answer, because we talk about how pennies aren't cheap, what year they made a bunch of pennies, and how they lost a bunch of money in the year that they made a bunch of pennies. So it's answer choice B for number 17. Now, when we continue reading, even though there isn't a question for a couple of sentences, we want to read every single word in an English passage because context is going to be the key to getting the questions correct. Economics professor Robert Waples cites another problem, the so-called penny tax, which is really a tax on time. When cashiers make change for a cash purchase, they often reach into the register's penny trays and count out 1 to 4. This is a grammar question because it asks us which answer choice is most grammatically acceptable. And immediately F is wrong. That comma doesn't need to be there. They often reach into the register's penny trays. This does not have a comma, and registers is a plural possessive. You can learn all of your English grammar rules in the study guide, so we'll move on to question 19. While the time it takes to do this may seem trivial, each year billions of cash transactions are made annually. Which choice is least redundant in context? So this is a reading comprehension question. And if you keep watching this video after the example questions, we're going to talk about how every reading comprehension question tells you what it's asking you to do. This question is clearly asking us not to have a redundant sentence. So answer choice A is redundant because it says annually and each year. So it can't be no change because that is redundant. That's the same thing. When you're answering a redundancy question, just don't repeat any information ever. Answer choice B, billions of cash transactions occur each year when physical money is exchanged for goods. This is also redundant because physical money exchanged for goods and cash transactions are the exact same thing, so that's redundant, cannot be D. Answer choice C, on a yearly basis, billions of cash transactions occur annually. There's yearly and annually. Again, those things mean the exact same thing, so it's not C. So the answer choice must be D. Billions of cash transactions are made each year. That is not redundant. These penny taxes in aggregate result in over 120 billion hours when cashiers and consumers could be completing more meaningful tasks. Proponents of pennies, often lobbyists for the mining of zinc being the primary component of pennies, argue that if pennies were eliminated, consumers would pay more for goods. Question 20. If the writer were to delete the underlined portion, adjusting the punctuation as needed, the paragraph would primarily lose. So this is clearly a reading comprehension question, and we have to answer what the paragraph would lose. So we have to describe what the underlined portion really is here. A suggestion that many proponents of keeping the penny in circulation may be motivated by self-interest. This is clearly going to be the correct answer because the underlined portion is saying that lobbyists are the proponents of pennies, and lobbyists being people who mine zinc, and zinc makes pennies. So people who want pennies to stay, mine zinc, and so they're in their self-interest. Moving on, question 21. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. Consistently, research shows that Americans respond negatively when prices increase due to inflation. Should the writer make this addition here? So again, this is a question where the answer choices start with yes and no. So we're going to read the second half, the explanation for why the answer should be yes or no in order to make up our mind about this question. Because it undermines the penny proponent's argument that eliminating the penny would cause consumers to pay more for goods. That is not true. It does not undermine their argument. It doesn't support their argument either. Because it cites research that strongly suggests most Americans favor the elimination of the penny. This did not cite any research having to do with the elimination of the penny. It just had to do with inflation. So it's not B. C, because it is unrelated to the writer's rebuttal of the argument made by the proponents of pennies. This is the correct answer because the author should not add in the sentence because it has nothing to do with pennies, which is exactly what the answer choice says. And then let's just eliminate answer choice D to be safe. No, because it supports the penny proponent's argument that consumers would have access to more goods if the penny were eliminated. Well, that's not the argument that penny proponents make, so that's false. And it also does not support their argument, so it's not D. The answer choice must be C. And we can always answer these questions by just reading the second half where it says, because it is unrelated to the writer's rebuttal of the argument made by proponents of pennies. That is clearly true. That is the best excellent explanation for this question. So the answer choice must be C. I didn't know whether the answer would be yes or no going into this question, but because I read the explanations for why it should be yes or no, then I was able to get it right. Canadian merchants round each cash purchase to the nearest nickel. If a hair comb costs $1.02, consumers pay $1. If it costs $1.03, they pay $1.05. Studies have shown that it's a wash. Overall, consumers pay no more or no less than they did when the penny was in circulation. This is a grammar question, so you can learn this more in the study guide, but it should be B here because there's an apostrophe in it's, and the word than is correct, not then. Bills for retiring the penny have been floating around Congress for decades. Whether out of nostalgia or fear of change, lawmakers have been disinclined to execute a proposed course of action. Which choice most effectively maintains the essay's tone? This is a reading comprehension question. Again, it is not going to be no change because that's a little bit too wordy for this passage. This passage is a little bit more direct. Haven't ratified a thing. That's a little bit too informal. Haven't closed the deal. A little bit informal. And answer choice B is both formal, but also not too wordy. You're really looking for a simple, sort of happy medium when you're answering tone questions. You don't want super fancy language, but you also don't want super informal language. You want to kind of find the middle ground when it comes to tone questions on the ACT. But the value of today's penny is defective. Which choice is clearest and most precise in context? This is basically just choosing the correct word for the sentence. It is not going to be defective. the value of today's penny is negligible. That is correct because that means it is very small. By retiring the penny, Congress could cut costs at the U.S. Mint while also giving cashiers some time back at work. Which choice provides the most effective conclusion by restating the main claims of the essay's argument? Could cut costs at the U.S. Mint while also giving cashiers some time back at work. That sounds like it's going to be the correct answer, but let's examine B, C, and D just to be sure. Reduce pollution? No, that's incorrect. The main argument of this passage had nothing to do with pollution. Free up time for workers at the U.S. Mint while also increasing the bargaining power of cashiers. This passage had nothing to do with the bargaining power of cashiers, so that's wrong. Reduce coin clutter. This had nothing to do with coin clutter, so it's not D. So the answer choice here is A, no change. All right, let's do another passage, and let's talk about a few more things to do with reading comprehension questions on the ACT. Now, like I mentioned, whenever I see numbers or letters in brackets, I want to pay attention to that because I know a question is coming where I'm going to have to place a sentence somewhere within the passage. So I just want to be aware of what's going on in the passage. But as always, step one is to start by reading the entire passage. Even though there aren't any questions in paragraph 1, I'm going to read the whole thing because I'm going to need that context to answer the questions correctly going forward. From the time Honor Frost made her first amateur underwater dive in the late 1940s, she was committed to spending as much time as possible exploring. She was consequently thrilled to be invited by professional divers to join the excavation of a first-century Roman shipwreck in the Mediterranean Sea in 1957, but what Frost witnessed during that excavation shocked her. The team, too, took little care with how they handled artifacts and little note of where they found them. So the answer here is going to be J. And if you keep watching this video, we're going to give a more in-depth explanation for this transition word question. But all of these transition words, to, nevertheless, and however, don't make any sense in the context of this passage. But keep watching this video and we'll give a more in-depth explanation for that question in just a second. A talented illustrator, Frost understood that the excavation of shipwrecks would benefit from the same systematic approach used on land. This is why you really need the context of the passage to answer a question effectively. A talented illustrator makes no sense here. It might be true that Frost is a talented illustrator, right? Given that all the choices are accurate, which one most effectively leads the reader from the preceding sentence to the information that follows? So this question is telling us exactly what we need to do. And it basically is telling us, find an answer choice. Find something that makes sense in the context of this passage. This is why you have to read the entire ACT English passage, because this is just a reading comprehension question. It has nothing to do with grammar. B, thanks to experience she'd gained on a formal archaeological land dig, Frost understood that the excavation of shipwrecks would benefit from the same systematic approach used on land. That's clearly the correct answer because it's talking about how she had experience on land and now she needs to use it again despite the fact that they're underwater. Let's just confirm that C and D don't make any sense. As one who rarely traveled without her trusty oxygen tank, that makes no sense in the context of the sentence. With an interest in the performing arts, that also makes no sense in the context of the sentence. So good. The answer is B. We're going to be placing something in paragraph 2 here, or have the option to. Frost made her first major discovery in 1960 with the excavation of a Bronze Age Phoenician ship that dated to 1200 BCE. The historical implications of the find were significant. Prior to the identification of the ship and its contents, this is a grammar question because it says grammatically, and the question here, the answer, is J. There's no apostrophe. It's with an apostrophe at the end there is actually not a word. It's means it is, and their contents is not correct here because this is a singular possessive. Prevailing wisdom held that the Bronze Age maritime commerce was dominated exclusively by the Mycenaean Greeks. In fact, most of them believed that the Phoenicians didn't sail the Mediterranean at all until the Iron Age. Which choice is clearest and most grammatically acceptable in this context? So this is really, really important. This is a grammar question, not a reading comprehension question, but it's also a grammar question that we could not have got if we hadn't read the entire preceding sentence, we wouldn't realize that there's nobody for them to refer back to. Most of them doesn't make any sense in this question. Who is them, right? Well, there's no one because there weren't any people mentioned in the previous sentence except for the Mycenaean Greeks. And the Mycenaean Greeks weren't the people that believed the Phoenicians didn't set sail in the Mediterranean. So most of them cannot be correct. Those individuals, same thing. Who are they? We don't know. They, same problem. And so the answer choice must be C, scholars, because we need a subject that makes sense. In fact, scholars believed that the Phoenicians didn't set sail in the Mediterranean at all until the Iron Age. The work of Frost and her colleagues fundamentally changed that understanding. Beginning in 1971, Frost directed the excavation of a 2,200-year-old Punic or late Phoenician warship off the coast of Sicily. The ship, which Frost surmised may have been sunk in a battle with a Roman vessel, was the first war galley of antiquity ever discovered. The excavation took several years. Which choice is least redundant in context? Whenever you see a least redundant question, you're just avoiding anything that repeats information. Typically, the correct answer on these questions is just going to be the shortest answer, which it is on this one, which is F, just the word excavation. But G, H, and J are all redundant, okay? And we know that because we've read the entire passage. So if you skipped the first few sentences before you answered question 30, you wouldn't realize that we already heard about a 2,200-year-old warship. We already heard that it was off the coast of Sicily, and we already heard that the dig began in 1971. So those are all redundant. They all repeat information that we already know because we already read it. During that time, as Frost's team recovered artifacts from the wreck, this is a grammatically acceptable question. This is a grammar question. Which choice makes the sentence most grammatically acceptable? During the time, as Frost's team recovered artifacts from the wreck, painstakingly recording and publishing their findings along the way. This seems correct. It seems like no change should be the correct answer, but there actually would not be a subject and a verb for this sentence if we don't have a subject here. So Frost's team recovered, that has a subject and a verb, making this a complete sentence. So the answer must be D here. When the excavation was complete, the remnants of the ship, remnants is the subject, that is plural, of the ship is a prepositional phrase. And so while this seems correct, the verb must be plural. You can learn all of these tricks to the ACT grammar section in the study guide. For Frost and the field of maritime archaeology, all at once history was being revealed and made at the same time. Which choice is least redundant in context? Well, it's not no change because all at once and at the same time mean the exact same thing, basically the exact same thing. So that's redundant. History was simultaneously revealed and made at the same time. That's redundant. Simultaneously and at the same time basically mean the same thing. History was concurrently being revealed and made at the same time, also redundant. History was being revealed and made at the same time. D is not redundant because it doesn't repeat any information, so it's the correct answer. 34, the writer is considering adding the following sentence to the essay. A member of the first civilian diving club in the world, Frost was fond of saying that time spent on the surface is time wasted. If the writer were to add this sentence, it would logically be placed at point A in paragraph 1. So remember, we paid attention to the numbers in brackets and the letters in brackets. So we want to see if this sentence makes sense being placed right here where there's a circle. From the time Honor Frost made her first amateur underwater dive in the late 1940s, she was committed to spending as much time as possible exploring. A member of the first civilian diving club in the world, Frost was fond of saying that time spent on the surface is time wasted. So that would make sense. We want to verify that the other answer choices don't make any sense before we commit to F being the correct answer. Point B in paragraph 2. That is right here. Prior to the identification of the ship and its contents, prevailing wisdom held that the Bronze Age maritime commerce was dominated exclusively by the Mycenaean Greeks. It makes no sense to talk about how our character was fond of saying time spent on the surface is time wasted here. It's not going to be anything in paragraph 2. Point D in paragraph 3 is the excavation took several years. Yeah, we're not going to have a sentence about how she was fond of saying that time spent on the surface is time wasted there either. So it's F. Suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to explore how a particular field of study has changed over the years. Would this essay accomplish this purpose? Pay attention to this question. It's the last question we're going to do, but it's a great example of how you need to answer these reading comprehension questions that have yes and no in them. If you just asked me this question, I would tell you that the answer would be yes. That the essay did talk about how a particular field of study has changed over years, because that's what it seems like the entire passage was about. But the answer to this is actually going to be C, and that says no. But let's explain exactly how you can get to that correct answer. Even though it seems like the answer should be yes, answer choices A and B are clearly wrong because the explanations don't make any sense. Let's read it. Yes, because in addition to discussing the origins of maritime archaeology, it also explains recent controversies in the field. Well, we read the entire passage. There aren't any controversies in this passage because in addition to Frost, it mentions some of the other founders of maritime archaeology. Now, this is really tricky because it actually does mention the founders of maritime archaeology, but suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to explore how a particular field of study has changed over the years. Would this essay accomplish that purpose? This explanation for why the essay accomplished the purpose of explaining how this field has changed, the explanation that the paragraph or the passage mentions the other founders makes no sense. It has nothing to do. The founders don't really have anything to do with how the field of study has changed over the years, so that can't be the correct answer. The explanation has to make sense and answer the question that's being asked. No, because it focuses instead on Frost and some of her most important contributions to maritime archaeology. That is the focus of the passage, so that must be the correct answer. D, no, because it focuses instead on Frost's accomplishments prior to her work in maritime archaeology. That's not correct because this entire passage was about Frost and her accomplishments in maritime archaeology, not the stuff prior to that. Okay, that does it for our example questions on the ACT English section. Remember, you should have seen why it's really important that you start by reading the entire passage and answering the questions as you come to them. And then the second thing we learned is that reading comprehension questions always tell you exactly what they want you to do. If it tells you that you need to choose the least redundant question in context, don't choose anything that has any repeat information. If you're answering a question that's about the tone of the passage, try to choose something that's in the middle. It's not too fancy, but it's not too simple either, okay? And if you want to learn more explanations and how to get even better at the grammar questions on the English section, keep watching this video.
Let's review some general rules for reading comprehension questions based on those examples. The first rule is context always matters. And that's why you need to read the entire passage. Even when a sentence doesn't contain a question, it will have information that will help you answer other or later reading comprehension questions. The second rule is that reading comprehension questions always tell you exactly what the question means. If you're asked to find something that is the least redundant answer choice, don't choose an answer that repeats any information. And finally, let's review some of the most common reading comprehension questions on the ACT. For questions that have answer choices that start with yes and no, or kept and deleted, you'll be able to eliminate some of the answer choices because the explanation that follows yes or no is just wrong. For example, it says a bunch of stuff that's just not true about the passage. So before you decide on the correct answer, just make sure the explanation for why it should be yes or no makes sense based on the context of the reading passage. For transition word questions, you need to connect the preceding sentence to the sentence following the transition word in a way that makes sense. Let's take a look at question 26 from the practice section we just did. The transition word to implies that there was another team of divers that took little care of artifacts they discovered, but we haven't read anything about another team of divers. The transition word nevertheless means that the information we're about to read happens despite the previous statement. It shows that the two sentences discuss conflicting information. And the transition word, however, also suggests that the information in the previous sentence conflicts with the current sentence. But the current sentence just explains what the previous sentence was talking about. There's no conflicting information, and there's no mention of another team of divers. So, answer choice J, which has no transition word, must be correct. Okay, we just talked through some examples of reading comprehension questions on the ACT English, and it's time to talk about step 3 for how to finish the ACT on time and get a high ACT English score. Remember, step 1 is to read the entire passage and answer the questions as you are reading. Step 2 is to know whether you're answering a grammar question or a reading comprehension question. And step 3 is to practice all the grammar skills necessary to answer those grammar questions that ask you which answer choice is grammatically acceptable quickly and accurately. If you practice the grammar skills in the Learn section of the study guide, you will get better at answering these questions correctly. And you'll get faster, which is key. Next, you should practice reading comprehension questions. And when you practice reading comprehension questions, you'll get better at answering them correctly, but you just can't rush when you're answering these questions because you need to think through the context of the passage. Remember, context is key on the ACT English section. And you're not just following the same strict rules that you must follow on the grammar questions. So going too fast on the reading comprehension questions might result in some unforced errors. So write down in your notes. Step 3 is to practice the grammar rules in the Learn section of the study guide and read the explanations for the questions you get wrong. Practice each of these 3 sections in the Learn portion of your study guide until you get the advanced badge, and you'll have a very strong grasp on the rules of grammar. Then practice reading comprehension questions and pay attention to the context surrounding the question. Remember, context is key on the ACT English.